Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, the climate guy setting the record straight about climate. This video is titled 50 Years of Climate Change at NCAR, the National Center for Atmospheric Research. NCAR is located on the side of a mountain in Boulder, Colorado, and they're celebrating their 50th anniversary. I ride my bicycle up there just about every day and I see some pretty amazing sights. I took these pictures up there yesterday. NCAR has a long tradition of excellence in weather modeling and weather research, and they've done some of the most important work that goes into current weather models. However, their climate story is slightly different, and I'm going to be covering that in this video. In 1971, NASA's top climatologist and NCAR's future top climatologist wrote a paper predicting a new ice age, possibly by the year 2020. This article was in the Washington Post, July 9, 1971. U.S. scientists sees new ice age coming. The world could be as little as 50 or 60 years away from a disastrous new ice age, a leading atmospheric scientist predicts. These conclusions, including the ominous exclamation point, rare in scientific publication, are printed in this week's issue of the journal Science, out today, signed by Rasul and Dr. Stephen Schneider. Dr. Gordon F. MacDonald, scientist member of President Nixon's three-man Council on Environmental Quality, said in an interview that these conclusions point out one of the most serious problems U.S. and other delegates must address next year. He called Rasul a first-rate atmospheric physicist. If we look at the actual paper which Rasul and Schneider published in Science, you see some very interesting things. From our calculation, a doubling of CO2 produces a tropospheric temperature change of 0.8 K. However, as more CO2 is added to the atmosphere, the rate of temperature increase is proportionally less and less, and the increase eventually levels off. Even for an increase in CO2 by a factor of 10, the temperature increase does not exceed 2.5 degrees Kelvin. Therefore, the runaway greenhouse effect does not occur. And here's the graph they published. They showed that an increase in carbon dioxide up to 2,400 parts per million, which is 6 times as high as current levels, would only increase temperatures by a little over 1 degree centigrade. So our top scientists have known for almost 50 years that the basis of current climate alarmism, the runaway greenhouse effect, is impossible. A few months later, 42 top American and European investigators met at Brown University under the auspices of the National Science Foundation, and they sent a letter to President Nixon warning of a new ice age within about a century. 1 year later, NCAR's president, Walter Orr Roberts, warned of an upcoming drought due to sunspot activity. Boulder, Colorado, Dr. Walter Orr Roberts, a research scientist who believes sunspots directly affect the weather on Earth, says a severe drought rivaling the Dust Bowl days of the Depression may hit the Great Plains next year or by 1975. Roberts, president of the University Corporation for Atmospheric Research, said yesterday an upcoming period of very little sunspot activity may signal an upcoming drought. Roberts said the sunspots follow a 20 to 22-year cycle, and the droughts of the Great Plains fit that same pattern. Coinciding with other periods of slack sunspot activity were the Dust Bowl days of the 1930s and the scorching days with little moisture in the 1950s. Based on the 20-year cycles, many scientists were expecting the drought last year, Roberts said. So it's very clear that NCAR's top people, Walter Orr Roberts and Stephen Schneider, did not see carbon dioxide as being a problem, and they believed that climate was driven by sunspot activity. And in 1974, Schneider and Roberts warned that the warm, nice weather the Earth had been experiencing was about to end, and that it was going to lead to a period of global cooling, unstable climate, crop losses, food shortages, and death by starvation for millions. They published this graph showing that Earth warmed quite a bit from 1870 to 1940, and that all of that warming had been lost again by 1970. And in fact, 1970 was actually cooler than 1870. In 1974, Walter Orr Roberts continued to discuss his forecast of a drought based on sunspot cycles. Also in 1974, Walter Orr Roberts attended a large meeting of climate experts in Bonn, West Germany, which was reported in the New York Times. Thursday, August 8th, 1974, climate changes endanger world's food output. A recent meeting of climate experts in Bonn, West Germany produced the unanimous conclusion that the change in global weather patterns poses a severe threat to agriculture that could lead to major crop failures and mass starvation. There is a growing consensus that the change will persist for several decades and that the current food production systems of man cannot easily adjust. It is also expected that the climate will become more variable than in recent decades. Dr. Roberts, who is program chairman of the Federation, said that scientists of several nations participated in the workshop. Its conclusions were unanimous. The mean temperature of the northern hemisphere increased steadily from the early 1900s through the early 1940s. Since then, it's been on its way downward towards the colder circumstances of the last century. The drop since the 1940s has only been about half a degree, but some scientists believe that it's enough to trigger changes that could have important effects on world's weather and agriculture. So everything that they now blame on global warming, back then they were blaming on global cooling. The summary statement of that report is one of the grimmest forecasts to be made in recent years. Dr. Walter Orr Roberts, one of the nation's foremost experts on climate, believes there is a growing consensus in his field that agrees with the workshop's assessment. Global cooling was a very bad thing. It was going to starve people to death. Also in 1974, Walter Orr Roberts published this paper, Climate Change and Its Effect on World Food, by Walter Orr Roberts, Aspen Institute for Humanistic Studies, and National Center for Atmospheric Research, Boulder, Colorado. In February 1972, Earth-orbiting satellites revealed the existence of a greatly increased area of snow and ice cover as compared to all previous years of space-age observations. Some scientists believe this may have presaged the onset of dramatic climate anomalies of 1972 that brought far-reaching adversities to the world's peoples. So back then, they saw that increasing snow and ice cover caused climate adversities. Now they blame climate adversities on decreasing ice cover. Moreover, there is mounting evidence that the bad climate of 1972 may be the forerunner of a long series of less favorable agricultural crop years that lie ahead for most world societies. Thus, widespread food shortages threaten just at the time the world populations are growing to new highs. Indeed, less favorable climate may be the new norm. The Earth may have entered a new little ice age. Perhaps this period will not be so extreme as that around 1700 AD, but it seems likely to be a cooler period resembling the climatic regimes of the period from 1880 to 1920. So 45 years ago, there was no question that the Earth was cooling, and it was seen as being a very bad thing. And the NCAR story continues in 1975. Chicago Tribune, June 2nd, 1975. Ice Age coming, chilling thought for humanity. Dr. Stephen Schneider, Deputy Director of a Climatic Study Project at NCAR, is one of those who are worried. If changing climate continues to cut into world grain reserves, political tensions between have and have-not nations could make the Arab oil embargo seem tame by comparison. Schneider told researchers at a meeting of the American Association for the Advancement of Science earlier this year. The vision of starving nations resorting to terrorism and perhaps even nuclear blackmail makes development of a world food security plan a matter of critical urgency, Schneider said. The New York Times reported in 1976 that Schneider went to the White House to try to warn them about the dangers of global cooling, and they were very depressed that nobody at the White House was listening to them. Also in 1976, Walter Orr Roberts and Stephen Schneider continued to discuss the idea of a drought driven by sunspot cycles. Remember, this is the same Stephen Schneider who in 1971 reported that a runaway greenhouse effect is impossible and that even a large increase in carbon dioxide will have minimal effect on the Earth's climate. And in 1978, Stephen Schneider was featured in a widely distributed video, The Coming Ice Age. He was discussing the possibilities of cutting off the ice age by melting the polar ice caps.
Climate experts believe the next ice age is on its way. According to recent evidence, it could come sooner than anyone had expected. At weather stations in the far north, temperatures have been dropping for 30 years. Seacoasts, long free of summer ice, are now blocked year-round. According to some climatologists, within a lifetime, we might be living in the next ice age. If an ice age is coming, what can we do to stop it? Nuclear energy might be used to loosen polar ice caps. Sea ice could be melted by covering it with black soot to increase the absorption of sunlight. Dr. Stephen Schneider is a climatologist from the National Center for Atmospheric Research.
Can we do these things? Yes. But will they make things better? I'm not sure. We can't predict with any certainty what's happening to our own climatic future. How can we come along and intervene then in that ignorance? You could melt the ice caps. What would that do to the coastal cities? The cure could be worse than disease. Would that be better or worse than the risk of an ice age?
So in the 1970s, NCAR's leaders did not believe that carbon dioxide was a serious issue, and they believed that the climate was driven by solar activity. Now let's fast forward to the present. Remember the NCAR graph from 1974 where they showed a sharp cooling after 1940 down to 1970, where all prior global warming had been lost? Well, now NCAR shows none of that. They just show a steady upward climb of temperatures since 1900. The global cooling after 1940 doesn't really exist anymore. And it's not just NCAR who's made the post-1940 global cooling disappear. All of the major government agencies in the world have similarly made that cooling period disappear. It no longer exists in the temperature record. This post-1940 global cooling has simply been erased. It's straight out of George Orwell's 1984. The Ministry of Truth erased an inconvenient part of history. NCAR is a very different place now under the leadership of Kevin Trenberth. I'm going to show you a few things which are going to shock you. This graph is prominently on display in the NCAR Museum. It purports to show that the number of record maximum temperatures has increased in the United States since the 1960s. The title of the display is A Century and a Half of Evidence, but for some reason, they only show half a century of evidence. What is it that they're hiding? Had they actually shown a full century of evidence, it would have been obvious that the number of record highs in the United States has dropped off sharply since the 1930s. They started their graph right here at a low point. That's incredibly deceptive. That's not science, that's fraud. And here's another wildly fraudulent display they have up in the NCAR Museum. It shows a relationship between Antarctic temperatures and carbon dioxide concentration. The idea of this exhibit is to convince you that CO2 drives Antarctic temperatures, but the relationship is the exact opposite. Geologists have known for well over a century that as temperatures of the ocean rise, the solubility of carbon dioxide decreases. So what happens is as ocean temperatures increase, the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere increases because it gets outgassed from the oceans into the atmosphere. So it's not carbon dioxide driving the temperature as NCAR is claiming, it's the exact opposite. The temperature is driving carbon dioxide. They're putting the cart before the horse. And let's look closer at this graph. They're trying to claim that a 100 part per million change in carbon dioxide is producing a 10 degrees centigrade change in temperature. That's utterly ridiculous. Not even the worst alarmists would believe such nonsense. Chris Landsey, the chief scientist at the National Hurricane Center, resigned from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in 2005 because his work was being interfered with by Kevin Trenberth, the director at NCAR. Landsey wrote, I personally cannot in good faith continue to contribute to a process that I view as both being motivated by preconceived agendas and being scientifically unsound. As the IPCC leadership has seen no wrong in Dr. Trenberth's actions and have retained him as a lead author for the AR4, I've decided to no longer participate in the IPCC AR4. It is beyond me why my colleagues would utilize the media to push an unsupported agenda that recent hurricane activity has been due to global warming. Given Dr. Trenberth's role as the IPCC's lead author responsible for preparing the text on hurricanes, his public statements so far outside of the current scientific understanding led me to concern that it would be very difficult for the IPCC process to proceed objectively. So a very strong pattern has emerged that under the leadership of Kevin Trenberth, NCAR's climate group has become politically motivated and their science has become extremely poor. 45 years ago, NCAR did real science. They understood that carbon dioxide did not drive the climate, they understood that runaway global warming was impossible, and they understood that the climate was driven by solar activity, not by man. I've done quite a bit of work as a contract software developer for NCAR on both their weather and their climate models. They have very good people there, and as I mentioned earlier, their weather models are among the best in the world. But sadly, their climate research under the leadership of Kevin Trenberth has become completely corrupted. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science for a long time.